welcome to the Startup Grind.
Without any further ado, I'd like to welcome our guest, Sarah Imbach. Come on up.
Thank you so much for warning me about
Yes.
that. Every introverted bone in my body is going.
Please don't do that. So let me, Jason, are we live here? Okay. Do we need the mic? Do you want the mic or not? Mic. You want the mic? Okay. Let me get in the. You take that one, Sarah.
Okay.
And now what is this one? So while I'm putting this on, I want Sarah to kind of give us the shortened version of your background, because I think it's really interesting. The operational piece is what I think is really the interesting part, not the investor piece. Not that the investor's not cool, but the operational things, so you actually understand how things work. Mm-hmm. I would love to hear 2-3 minutes about some of that background, so people kind of get the grasp of there's more to you than an angel investor.
Sure. So once upon a time, I went from working for really big organizations like healthcare. I was a NASA contractor. I worked at a university. And I got talked into coming into interview with a startup. I had no idea what the hell a startup was. It was 1999, 2000 era. Pets.com had blown all of their money on Super Bowl ads. And there was a little company called PayPal that was in the original Google offices. And there were 16 employees. And I walked in a suit, because that's what you do for an interview. And I met with 16 people, most of whom were on their first job. And the next thing you know, 6 weeks later, I'm employee 30 at PayPal. I went in as an IC, as a project manager, working for Reid Hoffman, who was the original COO, who's the person who actually talked me into going and talking to these crazy people. And I was suddenly home. I was like, this is what I was meant to do. 2 years later, most of us left PayPal because it got acquired by eBay. It IPO'd, then got acquired. A year off, because you've got to detox after a startup. I went to work at LinkedIn as employee 29. And by the time I left LinkedIn, I had everything except engineering. When I left PayPal, I had 2/3 of the employees. That's from being an IC. And went directly to 23andMe as their COO and was there for 18 months. I took off from there, took a couple years off, moved up here. And when I decided I was bored out of my mind, because I'm not meant to not work, because I make my husband crazy, I started working with startups in town, and that's how I actually ended up becoming an angel.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so you guys hear me now? Trace, you guys hear me back? Okay. So in that journey, which I'm sure there's lots of stories there, but
so many stories I can't tell you.
Exactly. Don't say the names. So in that journey, where was the things that you, where were the things that you were like pleasantly surprised that you were either really, really good at? Give us a couple things you're like, I was surprised I was good at X, and then I'm going to ask another question after that. Give me a couple things.
Couple things. So turned out that my superpower is that I make decisions really fast. And I'm really confident and comfortable with making decisions with not a lot of information and then correcting the decision. And that had not really ever been valued before, because most of the time you're working for people who want you to go through a big process. At a startup, it's survival. And so that turned out to be like this complete nirvana work experience for me, even in a really toxic, even the toxic environment parts of doing startups, which aren't crazy and insane and nobody should do them and they don't make any sense, except that they're a total rush. The other thing that it turned out that I was good at, that I didn't know I was good at, was actually hiring and developing teams. So at PayPal, and you gotta remember the vast majority of people at PayPal were on their first job. When we filed the S1, I was 31 years old and brought the average age of the S1 up for the executive team. So there was a huge operational component to that. And we had a call center in Omaha, Nebraska, as well as some operations in Palo Alto. And I think We got up to 350 staff, and in order to do the S1, we had to lay off approximately a third of that in a week and restructure. We also had brought that whole thing up in 6 weeks, like a year previously. So there were like these really crazy scale issues that we were dealing with. And I actually ended up doing it. I had no idea what the hell I was doing when I started, but I just did it and came out of it with a completely different level of confidence in my ability to execute in operations.
And so looking back on that, what were the things that surprised you were really bad at? Like, wow, I could have been a lot better there.
I was not a good advocate for myself at the first startup. That changed, but but I really wasn't in the first one. I didn't realize how much value I was adding because I was just going. The other thing I was not good at was navigating some of the politics. I've never been good at politics. I'm still not good at politics. I'm the person, and in fact, my most humiliating business experience happened at PayPal, and I got kicked out of a biz dev meeting. By Elon Musk, right? So there you go.
You got kicked out.
I did because I literally opened my mouth because here's this negotiation going on, and I got so frustrated with the speed or total lack thereof of the negotiation that I said something, and the second the words left my mouth, I was like, fuck.
Shouldn't have said that.
I should never have opened my mouth, right? Because the reality is in biz dev, silence is hugely powerful, right? Like. Yeah. Let the moment happen. Let somebody else say it. And I didn't, right? And then I had the reputation of not being good at biz dev for a really long time. And then I had to learn how to be good at biz dev. And I'm still really work at that because that's probably my least natural capability.
Yeah. And so if you and I were going to start a company next week, next month together, what would be the thing you would say, Mike, here are the couple things that I've learned that we really need to keep our pulse, really need to keep our eye on them? What would one or two things be?
We can only do 3 things at a time.
Okay.
If we don't have product market fit, we don't have a company. And we better have money to make it, we better have enough money to get to the milestone to get the next tranche.
Yeah, to make it to the next round of money. Yeah. And for those 3 things, what do you think the percentage of entrepreneurs today have those 3 things?
All 3 at the same time?
Yeah.
1%.
So in the last 100 meetings you've had, which is probably what? 8 months, 9 months? 100 meetings. How many of those meetings would you say, kind of have close to all 3 of those?
1.
Holy moly! 1 company? Did you write them a check?
It's really the money. The money is the biggest issue for all of those, and part of that's being an angel investor and sort of where the stage. But also the framework and logic that people are applying to how they're thinking about raising money. Right? That's sort of been when they walked in. There were some big voids in those areas.
Just cash in the bank kind of things, or just
understanding? So it's not even just cash in the bank. It's understanding how much do I really need? What am I going to use it for? And who's going to give it to me? And if I'm their first fundraising meeting, that's almost always a void.
Yeah. Sure.
And so that's why it puts that number. In terms of disciplined focus with great product market fit understanding, if we take the money part out of it, 3 or 4.
Yeah, so small number.
Yeah.
So you got to kiss a lot of frogs.
So many frogs.
So many frogs.
So many frogs. Which I did not know. Right.
Yeah,
when I moved to this side of the table, I had no idea.
Yeah, that was totally my next question. Was would you have done that if you knew that you kissed so many frogs? Would you have you know what? I'm just going to be an angel investor because it's got to be so much fun.
So I became an angel investor because there was sort of a weird path. I'd been up here for 2 years. Yeah. My kid was entering preschool. My husband told me I had to get out of the house. And I'm like, I got no network in Seattle. I have no idea how to get back in. And I thought I was going to take another operator role. So I started mentoring, just trying to meet entrepreneurs. And I'm like, surely there's got to be a cool company to go work for. And what I realized was as I was mentoring, I was like, okay, well, this is kind of fun. Then it was like, well, if I'm going to do this, then I want some skin in the game. So then I want to write a check, and the next thing you know, I've got a portfolio. And I don't have to work as hard. Like I can actually have fun and be involved, and some of them I go deep in, and some of them I'm totally passive. But I'm not working 100-hour weeks, which is really nice.
Which is nice. Yeah. And
but I didn't realize how hard Seattle was going to be, right? Like, so a very small portion of my portfolio is probably net in Seattle. Though some of my best companies are here, but Seattle is just a really brutal market.
For young...
it's really hard for entrepreneurs in Seattle for a couple of reasons. The ecosystem is not as dense as, say, New York or the Valley, right? And what that means is that a lot of entrepreneurs are learning things for... So glad you did that instead of me, because that's the kind of thing I do first, right out the door. There's so many things that entrepreneurs in Seattle are learning for the first time over and over and over. And in the Valley, especially, like it's just a very weird place. If you have a person, at least half the people they know have either been at a startup, started a startup, are in a startup, are leaving a startup. And so all of these sort of core basic truths about startups are just part of the knowledge set. And in Seattle, if you start a company, and you're especially a venture scale company, there's not a huge peer network that tells you like, here's the ins and outs and here's who's writing checks now. And so you're like starting over every time. That's just difficult. That's a harder environment. Right? Yeah. And then if like, forget it if you get to like Montana, right? Like, I mean, it's just so hard. There's nobody.
Or South Dakota. So let's talk a little bit about that part of the fundraising. We briefly touched on it, chatting beforehand. And I've talked about this for 5 years. How different it is for certain types of companies in Seattle to raise money versus just go south, my friend, just go south. So what is your belief on, and when I say go south, I'm just saying go into the Valley, just in case you didn't realize what I was talking about. What's your take on that, and do you think it's gotten any better? So you've been here 5 years, right?
I've been here 6 years. I've been active in the ecosystem 3.5.
Yeah. So what's your take on how it's done in 3.5 years? Let's say gotten from point A to point B, good, better, good, better, worse, whatever. Answer that one first, and then we'll go to the next one.
So it kind of depends on the stage, right? So I think that one of the things that is also unique in Seattle is that there are a very limited number of angels who write multiple checks. There are plenty of people who write one check, probably to somebody they know. But what that means is when you have very few people, they periodically go illiquid. And when I got here, there were 25 to 30 people who I got introduced to, which is lovely because Seattle will introduce you to everybody, which doesn't happen anywhere else. And that's one of the nice things, who were writing checks. And so if I wrote a check, likely I had co-investors. In the time that I have been there, of those 25 to 30, approximately 2 to 3 are still writing checks. And that's because some of them are now writing funds, but that's narrows the thesis, right? So now you have to have a thesis threshold, not just, hey, that's a cool thing, and I like it, and I like you, so I'll write you a check. There's a ton of people who are completely illiquid, and there's a bunch of people who are like, yeah, I'll wait for an exit, I'm out for a while. And they're just on the side, or they have a project that they want to do, or something else. The thing with angels is it's your own money, not a VC where that's an institutional amount of money, a limited partner is giving you the money. So you don't get paid for what you do, and you're usually doing it as a hobby, right? It's even if you're full-time working on it, it's a hobby. Other things pick up your interest, and that in the Valley especially, and New York's a little bit more liquid than this. There's just so many more people who will write checks. So
it's just more fish.
6 weeks, coffees in the Valley raise 1.5 to 2 million. with reasonable product market fit, good technologists. Here could take you 6 to 12 months and you might not get your money. Right? That is an execution opportunity delta that's massive.
Yeah. Yeah. And so what types of company, if I said, Sarah, what companies would you want to start in Seattle? What give me a type of companies you would say, you know what, I would want to do these and these.
So I think Seattle has amazing depth in all of the mixed reality sciences.
Sure.
That's still nascent. Like I think people got overexcited about how fast that was going to go to adoption, and I think you have to be very specific on the use cases, but I think that's still a big opportunity. AI and machine learning, again, so much depth of talent in Seattle. Figuring out the applications that are most interesting in that space, I think is interesting. There's really good SaaS talent. And not just in the technical side, because one of the things with, if you're doing SaaS, is you really got to figure out how to take that thing to market. So you've got to have good salespeople, and you've got to have good marketers. It's one of the areas where I think there is marketing talent. Marketing talent is super hard to get because it's like in demand for everybody, so super competitive. I would rather hire a VPE than a VP marketing unless I'm hiring from outside of Seattle, right? Just because of how difficult that position is to fill right now. E-commerce, but e-commerce is hard, right? There's only so many new things. You want to be careful about how much money you raise in e-commerce. Consumer is not what I would do here. And then there's some deep tech, enterprise level fundamental tech that's way outside my bailiwick, but I think that there's definitely some talent here for that.
And, oh, my mic's not actually working.
Oh, yeah, there you go.
Got some sound. Got a big voice. Wow. Lost my train of thought on that one.
It's scary when you
It is.
scare yourself a little
Scare
bit.
myself
Yeah.
a little bit. Wow, that guy's got a big. Oh, that's me. The ecosystem that we have.
Mm-hmm.
If you could plant two things, what would you plant in the ecosystem? Assuming they grow.
Mm-hmm.
Let's assume those two things you plant grow. What were the two things you plant in the ecosystem? Talking about Seattle.
Can I weed something out too?
You weed one thing out, but you got to plant two.
Okay. I'm going to weed out non-competes. I'm going to take the Christopher handbook and say that non-competes totally benefit the large corporation. And while a lot of them are not enforced, it's the fear of the enforcement that actually creates some difficulty. So I would do that. The second thing that I would really love to see is I'd love to see some energy for the rinse and repeat. So good or not, in the Valley, there's this idea. Somebody explained it to me once, who was like trying to make their first million and ended up becoming a VC because he wanted to get his 100 fast. But most people are trying to make their first million so that then they can make their first 10 million, so then they can make their first 20 million and get entry into the club so that you can make your 50, so you can make your 100. And that is the way everybody who's doing startups thinks. Like, I don't know that that's great for building great companies, by the way, right? Because building great companies means that you have to have a vision of why you're doing what you're doing. And people who tend to be thinking more about, I got to get to my first 10, are thinking, I'm going to build something, somebody's going to buy me, right? I'm going to get rich. Rarely happens. I don't know of anybody who started something to make 10 million that actually did. But this competitive edge means that people who would otherwise sit in relatively cushy jobs take risks because they know the fallback is, well, at least I got acqui-hired for $1 million. So I didn't really lose any ground in my career, and I feel like in Seattle there is a big sense, and I think this goes hand in hand with the non-competes, of if I try this, a failure hurts my career. And instead of it like, wow, it could actually create new opportunity. And so there's a reluctance for people who have all the capabilities and all the ideas to actually take the risk. And the second thing is a whole lot more cash.
Yeah,
Whole lot more cash.
just pour it in.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And where is where's the sweet spot in Seattle in your opinion? Like what's the thing that is just
Grit. Super, super gritty entrepreneurs. For all the reasons that I just went through, all the negatives, the entrepreneurs that persevere and make it are the grittiest set of entrepreneurs I've ever come across. And I have great confidence that if you can get through their humps, like they will just nail it.
Yeah.
Like, hands down.
Yeah. That's I would, like, I think you know Nick, right? You know Nick at OfferUp?
I don't. That's Serena's.
Oh, that's Serena's. Okay.
Yeah, I'm Outreach.
That's all right.
Pick an O company.
Yeah.
Which one are you on the board of?
Exactly. Okay, so let's take a step sideways, left, back. Where are some things that are exciting going, like industry, like as a prognosticator, fortune teller? Where do you think some industries that you would want to see things happen and you think are happening? Like, if I'm an entrepreneur again, if you and I start a company and you say, Mike, here's some things you should be looking at. What would those 1, 2, 3 industries or what would they be?
I'm not a great prognosticator. Like, this is not really my thing. I'm better at hearing something and going, yes, right? Like the edit as opposed to the creation. Having said that, I think that we are barely at the tip of what natural language processing is going to do to the way that we interact with the world. Every individual, there's not much that we have in consumer tech, and I'm a consumer person, right? Like I came up through consumer, I get consumer, and there's not much consumer here, so I tend to like wish for more consumer stuff. But having said that, there's not much in tech that you didn't see a version of in old Star Trek episodes, Star Wars episodes. I don't know how much sci-fi you read, but if you read like heavy duty sci-fi, like there's so many things, even from books from the 60s, that really are the technologies that we use today. And the big piece that had not really been there is voice. And this idea that you're going to interact with all of the technological tools, not by actually touching anything, not by looking at anything, but by the oral processing of commands and ideas, and doing that in a way that you don't need to understand the logic or the syntax. And for me, every time I see things that really rely on NLP or the AI behind that, they're really enterprise focused. Good reason, paying customers. I think there's massive opportunities in the consumer side.
Yeah.
And it is way beyond Google Home and Alexa and
The chatbot.
the chatbots. I think people are thinking iterative, and there's going to be somebody who thinks inflective. And when you get to that inflective, we're all going to be like, oh, of course. There's something there.
Yeah.
That's probably the thing that I'm most interested to see, but I don't really know exactly what it's going to look like.
Yeah.
And I certainly think that that we're walking some really interesting lines with machine learning in general, and like who's actually in charge of all the data.
Yeah. And Sarah, where is your like temperature gauge of the Microsoft, Amazon, Expedia, like, are they doing a good job for the startup community? I'm just focused on that. I don't care about anything else. Like, are they doing a good job? Are they doing their share? Do you think, like, what do you think the big corporations are in Seattle are doing for us, for the people in this room?
I don't know that I have a great answer for that, because I suspect there's a lot of things that are being done. Like, I know there's a bunch of people, individuals who I've met at Amazon who are actively trying to help startups who are coming out of the AWS group, the Alexa Fund. But Amazon enforces non-competes, and they're kind of known for, hey, hey, if it's at all interesting to us, we're going to build it. We don't want anybody else to do it. And so there's a hold off on anyone doing it. I'm not saying that Google's better than Amazon by any stretch of the imagination, but the thing that is true in California with no non-competes, and Google especially, is they're perfectly happy for somebody to spin out, take something that they're already working on at Google, go make it amazing, and then buy them back. Yeah. That has actually created huge technical leaps, right? Like Google's got all sorts of other problems, including go-to-market. But it's one of the things that actually creates a whole bunch of people. And so if you went to that company, even if you didn't stay at Google the next time, then you got the bug to go start another company and push the technology even further. I don't see that here, and I don't see it sponsored by either Microsoft or Amazon, and I don't even think of Expedia in that realm.
Yeah, no, Expedia is probably not a good example. What concerns me is the people at Amazon, Microsoft, some of those people have made shit tons of money.
Yeah. And they don't invest it back in the
And they don't put
ecosystem.
anything back in the ecosystem.
Yeah.
Seattle is one of the top places to donate money, by the way. I mean, it's one of the top cities in the
It
U.S.
is the top. There are more nonprofits per capita in Seattle than any other major
We
US
love
city.
to give our money away.
Absolutely.
But we haven't
And we give it to people who are doing all the same thing. So the overlap in nonprofits is remarkable.
Yeah.
When I first got back into stuff, I actually thought I was going to help nonprofits and I was going to apply all this business logic and guerrilla tactics. Like, okay, that's not going to work. And I'm out. Yeah, all those mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
I think that all the people I know who are actually active angel investors who do it seriously and really want to not only do it as an asset class, right? Because if you're an angel investor and you're not thinking about it as a portfolio, like you're just writing a single check. You're not really an angel. But you also are doing it because you want to pay it forward a little bit. You want to support entrepreneurs. You want to support entrepreneurial pursuits. It's really hard to understand what metrics matter and how to approach an entrepreneur's idea or company or product if you've never done it before. So if you made all your money in a completely de-risked business, going in very late when the only risk you were taking was you might not get a good evaluation, you probably don't understand this class as an asset.
Yeah.
Like you don't get it. And if you try and evaluate it on how fast you're getting to profitability, you're probably asking that company to do unnatural acts that will kill it or make it so small that it can't raise money.
Yeah. If you're gonna hire your first or one of your first, say, 10 people, right? And you got this great guy at one of these, great woman at one of these big corporations, it's a great fit. What do you say if I'm the CEO of that company saying, hey, Sarah, I found this great fit over here at Microsoft. She's wonderful. She's done all these cool things. She's willing to join. What's your advice to me?
As the CEO or as the person
I'm the
who I'm
CEO.
trying to recruit?
I'm the CEO.
Uh-huh.
I'm hiring smart person from Microsoft as probably maybe employee number 7.
Wow, that feels high risk.
Yeah, so that's what I'm.
That's what you're trying to get to,
yeah,
isn't
exactly.
it?
What would
Okay,
would you tell me?
Well, so I would say you have to spend a lot of time. For anyone who's joining a startup who has no idea what it takes to be in a startup or to run a startup, getting their risk profile is super important in whether or not they will be successful, right? Like they either get the risk profile or they don't. It is the same reason why for me, hiring in pre-100, I hire MBAs as an exception, not as a rule, right? Like you've got to prove to me that the MBA has not corrupted your entrepreneurial spirit. And the reason why, and I use that as sort of the analogy because when you work in a large corporation and you have been successful, you have had resources and you have learned to de-risk failure. Being in a startup is about taking massive risk with no resources and being okay with failure because you know you can correct, right? and by the way, fail fast only means recover from failure fast. Right? It doesn't mean do a lot of it. But it's that same thing. So if you were trying to recruit somebody out of a large company, I don't really care which company, it's really about them understanding the risk profile. And let's face it, the perks in most companies that have a tech basis especially are so sweet that's pretty cushy. And if you want a lifestyle, like, you're not going to go join a startup. You go join a startup for other things. It's not that.
Yeah, I would, the mistakes that I've seen just in the last few years from people, hey, I'm thinking about it, and I'm like, wow, stop that, because there's something, they have no clue what they, like, having the Microsoft.com by your email address means people actually answer your email address. Having XYZstartup.com as your email address, people are like, who the hell is XYZstartup.com?
That's right.
Never heard of you guys.
Yeah.
So I'm not returning this email.
That's right.
It's a whole different mindset. Like, I can't pick up the phone and call you because you're like, I don't know who the hell you are.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not Microsoft, right? So that's the thing that I think entrepreneurs forget is it's so easy. Not easy, nothing's easy, but when you have a Microsoft or Amazon.com email address.
Right. When you're an agent of a company that has that level of brand, it is a whole different ballgame.
Yeah. Just literally outreach. So where is the where's the fun part of Sarah? What's the fun things you do? What is, like, why do you seem obviously passionate about this. I know that is the case. Like, what is it gets you up in the morning? Why do you do this? You've had some great experiences. I'm being in 2 companies, sub 50 employee. That
3.
I mean, those are
Yeah.
great experiences.
It was 29, 31, and 32.
Yeah. Like, why do you do?
Why do I keep doing this?
Yeah.
Couple of reasons. So when I look back on that era of my career, the thing I am most proud of is we created entire industries. We created jobs that had never existed before. We created the ways that people did things that hadn't existed. And that's an amazing legacy. And so when I meet entrepreneurs who have that level of passion, I want to pay it forward, right? I was lucky and I worked really hard and I was at great places. That deserves to be paid back. So that's a big portion of it.
Yeah.
And I don't have any hobbies. I really don't. I have a 6.5-year-old.
I was going to say you have a child. That's a
I have a
hobby.
6.5-year-old, so that definitely is why I don't want to do the 100-hour weeks, right? But yeah, if people have a dream that I can get and I can help, I want to.
Yeah. And 5 years from now, no, let's not even say 5 years, so 3 years from now, what's going to be your best investment?
I have no idea. I can tell you what they are right now, but I can't tell you what they're going to be in 3, right?
What's your
I mean,
guess?
those are crazy windows.
2 years.
I'm going to answer the question in a completely different way.
Okay.
So before I joined LinkedIn, Reed was actually doing his angel round, and I talked him into letting me write an angel check. It was my first angel investment, and it's still paying for everything I'm doing now. I don't know if anything's going to beat it.
Yeah, probably not. That's going to be a tough one to beat.
Yeah,
It's a pretty tough one.
yeah.
Yeah,
Take the opportunity when it's right in front of you.
Yes, early on. Yes, very early on LinkedIn. And where do you where do you think? Like, Seattle is a very busy place right now. I mean, it's one of the top cities in the.
Over 120 tech centers or something crazy like that.
I mean, there's co-working spaces everywhere.
Yep.
What part of the world do you live in? What part of the city do you live in? Like,
I'm in Kirkland.
You're in Kirkland.
My husband's a car guy. Seattle is not going to work.
Not going to work, no. Where do you think Seattle's going to go in the next couple of years? I mean, I've been here for 20 years.
Yeah.
And this is my 20th year. I mean, it's truly been amazing. Like, where do you see the next few years going? As a city and the ecosystem, what do you think? Like, what's it?
I feel like I haven't been here long enough to even answer that question, right? Like the thing that I've noticed about coming lately to Seattle is my perspective when I talk to people who came, especially in the 90s, right? Like the first Microsoft heyday, like the perspective of what's changed and what hasn't changed is so different than an outsider's view. Like for me, to go from Kirkland to Seattle and back, like I'm over here a couple of times a day. Like I don't really ever want to work in Seattle because it's a pain in the ass to park. But I just sort of go back and forth over the bridge. But I talk to people who are in Seattle and like the east side is like, oh my God, it's so far away. And for people on the east side, it's like, you go over 520? Really? I'm like, yeah. On the other hand, that's how I feel about Mercer Island. Like Mercer Island is, I don't even know where. And so I think that as you get more and more migration of people coming in, I think that's going to change. Especially if they're coming up from California, because long time ago in my career, I lived halfway between Palo Alto and South San Francisco because we had hospitals on both sides. And so I was going back and forth. So half the time I was in San Francisco, half the time I was in Palo Alto. I won't even fly. If I fly into San Francisco, it's a San Francisco trip. If I have to go to the Valley, I fly into San Jose. I will not do the 101 corridor anymore. And I did that thing for 25 years. It's so hard to do those kind of commutes. So you come here and it's 15 minutes, you're like, whatever. Yeah. Like it's all the same.
Yeah.
But that's a new resident attitude. And I don't see it even from people who've been here for a really long time. But there's more and more people who have moved here. So I think that that's going to really change.
Yeah.
And I think it's just going to start to blend.
Yeah. Question I ask probably every single guest. How did you make your first dollar that wasn't from a relative? What did you do to make that first dollar? And how old were you?
That wasn't from a relative.
Yeah, so you actually had to earn the
money. I
money.
had to earn it. I had to have a job.
Yeah. Like, what was your first gig?
I keep thinking that I should have done something when I was a little kid. I don't think I did. But I had a part-time job from the time I was 14, and the first job I had was washing dishes at a country club. I was 14, and I worked 20 hours a week.
Yeah. And how did you get that job?
I was a theater geek, and I was a freshman, and there were seniors who worked at the country club as waiters and waitresses and told me there was a job.
Yeah, there you go. What would you tell? What advice would you tell an entrepreneur that is been working on their startup for a few months, maybe on the side, working somewhere else? They're kind of getting ready to jump off the ledge, so to speak. What would you tell them to do before they quit their day job? What 2 pieces or 3 pieces of advice would you say, you better have these things before you stop getting income? What would those 2 things or 3 things or 4 things be?
Yeah, in Seattle, it's slightly different for Seattle than it would be in the Valley, honestly. Sure. But in Seattle, you've got to know where your investment's coming from if you're going to need investment. If you're not going to need investment, obviously it doesn't apply, but almost everybody that I've ever come across in Seattle, regardless of whether it's what we would call a lifestyle business all the way down to, and lifestyle businesses can be everything from like a restaurant to a very small services business, like any of those, all the way up to, hey, I'm going to go do a consumer internet and I need to raise $20 million. You have to have a plan for the cash because it's almost impossible to figure that out once you're already stressed, right? Like, so while you still have income, understand what that's going to look like and how long it's going to take. And then the second thing is I would really want to understand exactly who my customer is and exactly what problem. The number of people who have a great product, but they don't understand who their customer is, or who are solving a problem, but it's not a problem that people actually care enough to pay for. that gets you in a lot of trouble. And I see people come up with those kinds of situations, and they're not aware of how it's going to be evaluated by those same people who write the checks. And you have to understand that other side of the table.
Yeah, it would be, I think understanding the other side of the table is the hard part, because if you've never been on the other side of the table, it's hard to understand what goes on the other side of the table.
Oh yeah, even from like when I was reporting to a board, like I wish that I had the insight that I have now sitting on boards. Then I would have been so much better.
Yeah.
Holy cow. And I wouldn't have wasted time spending on things that like now I get that they really don't care about and why.
Yeah. Where do you get that? Where do you learn that stuff?
Which piece? The how
other
to
side
think
of the
about your
table.
business,
The
the other side of the table,
Yeah,
and
like-
what matters.
Yeah.
There are a couple of good blogs. Angel VC is a good one. The SaaStr's not bad. The stuff that Brad Feld and those guys have done has been very good, of really breaking down how they think about startups and how they think about investing. I think these kinds of events actually help, right? Because it's a really informal way of getting insight into somebody who actually writes checks without actually having to go ask them to write you a check. Because like from the second somebody walks in, I'm looking for a reason to say no, right? I can't write more than, I don't write more than 5 to 6 checks a year of varying sizes. And if I'm seeing between 100 and 200 companies, that's a lot of no's. So I was like, if I can get to a no fast, that's easy for me. That's how I manage my time. So I think that these kinds of things, there are some groups in town that now seem to really be concentrating some of this. The Female Founders Alliance, Leslie's group, some of the stuff that Dave Parker has been putting together with the 6-month startup group. He's now took over Angels Pitches and Beers and puts together a pitch clinic in advance of that, which I think is pretty helpful, because it's not something that really penalizes you if you go in front of that group and they like barf all over your presentation. It's like free feedback, and it's not really going to hurt you in your fundraising. I think all of those are helpful. Somebody told me that Jason Calacanis's book Angel, it was entertaining, but actually had a couple nuggets. I haven't read it, so I don't know. I think those are all good sources. The best source is go talk to somebody who's raised money. Like, hands down, if you can go talk to an entrepreneur who's raised money, especially in Seattle, that is your best insight into what matters and what doesn't matter. And, frankly, who the good guys are and who's an asshole.
Because they exist.
Oh, they exist.
Feel free to start asking questions, guys. Go ahead, Mike.
Mike Meekum, great talk, thank you. I want to double click a little bit on your PayPal experience.
Mm-hmm.
Much has been written about PayPal, PayPal Mafia. I work for YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really curious, what are the top 2 or 3 things, common themes across these folks that you grew up with at PayPal that have gone on to be successful?
There's so much that's been written on this, right? And that picture's kind of infamous. It excluded a lot of people who were part of the core success, but certainly captured some of the most interesting ones. There's a couple of things that we learned at PayPal as a sort of group that don't make us necessarily pleasant people to work with, but make us successful. And I'm going to put myself in there because it's part of how I then did the next 2, right? Being absolutely ruthless about what matters is how you, with very little cash and very little time, can parse out all the things that you're not going to do. And what you say no to is probably more important as an entrepreneur than what you say yes to. Shamelessly looking at your competitors and what works for them and adopting it, not illegally, but pushing that boundary, being absolutely aggressive in winning, right? That is the culture that was at PayPal for 2 years before it sold. It was not always pleasant. It was survival of the fittest. There were massive turnover. All of the quote unquote adults that had been hired didn't survive it. It was just raw intelligence and ruthlessness.
Sounds like a fun place to work.
Detox
Yes,
took a long time
Took a long time.
for everybody.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Curious to know, when should you be raising funds for your company? Like, should you start early? Should you start like after you have a prototype, or when you get your first customer?
So
It kind of depends.
when you should be raising your funds. I just want to make sure everybody heard it.
Yeah. So when do you actually start raising money? Like, what's the stage? So there's two things that I think are important to actually put around that, because the answer is, I don't know.
It depends.
It depends. But what I will say is that raising money is biz dev, right? Not sales. So if you think about raising money as transactional, like I go in, I pitch you, you write me a check, like you're already off. If you have an idea and there are people who write checks who get interested in that idea, go start talking to them, right? They'll tell you when they'll write you a check. So the reality is that you want to build those relationships. And this is even more true for venture, by the way. Like, so it's one thing with angels, because we're kind of like flaky, honestly. But when you get to venture, like, you don't go down and like start the conversation when you're almost out of money, right? You want to be getting them excited about when you go do your raise. Oh, I'm going to do my raise in a year. I thought I'd get to know you, see if we're interested, meet your partners, right? It's all of that biz dev work that you do in advance. And again, they will tell you what metrics they're looking for. They will tell you the stage that they come in at. So it depends. Somebody else back there had a question. Yes, sir.
If you just elaborate a little more on the boardroom table, you said you wish you knew some things that you.
Oh yeah, so it mostly applied back in the LinkedIn days, where, I mean, LinkedIn launched before Facebook, but then Facebook came along and like just was a rocket ship, right? And LinkedIn was still sort of slogging through because we weren't social. We were professional, and the discipline of staying professional is entirely what created LinkedIn's success, right? If we had pivoted to try and compete with Facebook, like, you would not have heard of LinkedIn. And LinkedIn came after MySpace, right? So it's not that there hadn't been social first, right? And was it Friendster was also there? I should know that because that was Pincus. But really understanding, when I was sitting in the board meeting, that literally the board members had no comprehension of what the slog looked like, because it wasn't how they thought about the business, and which metrics we could have talked about in a much more simplistic way without getting into the detail of why we were making the product decisions, the recruiting decisions we were. Like, I could have taken it up way more high level, spent about half the time, and probably had more success in some of those meetings, because some of them just like rat-holed, like it was so bad. And now from this side, it's like when I walk into a board meeting and the company's got a vision document that is so many words that there's no one in the company who's ever going to remember what the real nugget is, I'm like, oh yeah, I remember doing that. So now I'm like, I mean, it's good because I can help them understand why not to do it. But yeah, like the experience on this side of like not making those mistakes, just such a waste of energy when you're prepping for board meetings, because it takes real work to do it.
And I would add a note to that. Sarah is actually a great board member. There are bad board members, and they are not helpful. So you need to interview your board member just like you would interview an employee. They're absolutely different. The same. I mean, there's the same process. It's not like, hey, there's a smart person. He's my advisor. He's going to be my board member. Make sure that they are good people, because they can be bad, do bad things to you.
Yeah, and a bad board member will like just completely Shanghai everything.
Yeah.
It's so painful.
Yeah. So you better interview those people.
So can you talk a little bit more about what you like to see? Like if you go into a board meeting and you're like, oh yeah, they nailed it. This is exactly what I want, what I look for. What would that look like?
What I look for, or what I think that they should be doing.
But
So I mean, one of the things I think is very true is like board members generally have multiple boards, right? And venture definitely. And so training your board members about how to think about your business is incredibly important. So part of that is your board deck looks the same every time, right? Like if these are the 4 metrics as a board member I should know about your business, don't show them differently, like the same every time. Show me the difference between the last time I saw you and this time when I saw you. Keep it strategic. I can't really help you with the day-to-day, right, as a board member. It's important that I understand the negatives as well as the positives, right? So, but you've got to keep it at the strategic level. The things that I personally start looking for are how tight is your vision and your execution plan. Can you convey what you're supposed to be doing or what you're trying to accomplish in very few words in something that I believe everybody in the company can replicate? Because when I don't see that, I get really nervous, right? Because an executive team that can't get it super tight to the point that I as a board member remember it meeting to meeting means your leadership doesn't either. And I guarantee by the time you get to the staff level, they have no clue what they're actually supposed to be doing.
That's great.
Yeah.
How do you view startups doing something crypto related or something on the blockchain? What is that like for you as an angel investor thinking about, sort of the economics of it and
Yep.
the future of that stuff, which is pretty unclear as far as regulations go and all that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting space. There's a couple of funds that I think are, from an LP standpoint, are actually kind of interesting because they're de-risking it for the LP because they're spending a lot of time with the individual companies. What I think is true is that the entire blockchain tech set, right, like the core components of that and what that enables, especially cross-border, is really interesting because that level of authentication and the crowdsourcing of that kind of authentication creates whole disruptive industries that I don't think we really understand yet. So like the individual coins aren't as interesting to me as the crowdsourcing of the blockchain. I don't know if that really answers it, but that's how I think about it.
Do you own any Bitcoin?
No. Yeah.
I was curious, it sounds like from your background, you weren't the founder yourself, but you joined early. How did you go about selecting and being choosy about what companies to work for?
Are you kidding? So there's like this whole like, oh, you chose that. The only one I chose was 23andMe, honestly. So I had met Reid Hoffman when he was winding down SocialNet. We were both speaking at a conference. We were at the speakers dinner. We sat next to each other. He was winding down SocialNet. He was going as COO to PayPal. I was getting laid off of the UCSF Stanford Healthcare because we were pulling them apart. That was a horrible idea. And we just started talking. And he's like, I really need a project manager. And I'm like, okay, well, I'll come be a project manager. Like, that's what I do. And we just hit it off. And so he recruited me. And I was like, this is awesome. And then I had taken a year off, got married. I had been doing some consulting. I suck as a consultant. Not my forte. And I went back to the Valley, and I was actively looking for a gig. And I had been around LinkedIn from the very early days. I think I remember like in the first 200, right? Because the original membership of LinkedIn, it was Reed's Rolodex. And I was getting nagged because I hadn't accepted my invitation. But I was one of the beta testers. Like there was sort of that thing. And so I was actively looking for a job. There wasn't a job for me at LinkedIn, but he was about to go raise Series B, and he just needed somebody who could be an operator, because Reed's a visionary, not an operator. And so I took a gig, right? So there was not like thoughtfulness in any of those. If you see opportunity, jump on it.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Is there something you miss about working in a startup, and would you go back to it, or do you plan?
Yes and yes. The thing that I miss the most, and I get a little bit of it doing what I'm doing. It's just enough to sort of, while I have a kid who's in first grade, keep me out. Sitting at a table with incredibly smart people, solving really hard problems is a high for me like nothing else. Literally will sit in those rooms after 6 hours, and it's like I'm stoned out of my mind, just so high. And you don't get that anywhere else, not at that kind of level, where you're also trying to actually get it to market, right? There's people who do that at a think tank, there's people who do that in the government, but they're not trying to get it into something, and that combination for me is just an unbelievable rush. Because I've been the number 2 a couple of times, for me in some ways it would only make sense if I had an idea and I wanted to go found it myself, and I haven't had that idea where I'm like, oh yes, I can't not do that. And I think as an entrepreneur, you should only actually do it if you can't not. That should always be the bar. Yes, ma'am.
Can you talk, in the beginning you talked about how you didn't know your worth. How did you, as a woman, identify your worth and start building on that? Did I misunderstand?
No, you didn't. I would say that was something that I didn't do particularly well ever. Other people might think that I did it okay. I did get savvy about, oh, that's a term that you can put into an employment contract? Awesome, I want that term. And those sort of became learnings because somebody around me had done something smart. I'm like, I'm gonna do that. I missed that last time, I'm gonna do that. The other thing was, for me, I was having so much fun that I was thinking about the moment. It took me a while to think about, yeah, and I should get paid for it. I'm not saying I didn't get paid well, but I did. But it's the thinking around it.
How do you fix that? How do you fix that thinking around that? That's a very common human trait.
It really is, and I don't have a good answer. I still struggle with it in certain things. I've watched, the best thing for me has been I've watched other people who always sort of seem to get theirs, and I'm like, what are they doing that I am not doing? How do I do more of that? For example, I learned very quickly, oh, well, if I'm not going to report to you, then I get full acceleration. That's super valuable, turns out. Or if there's a diminishment of duties, I get at least 50% acceleration. Those clauses are hard to get the first time. They're easier to get the second time. By the time you're on your third at-bat, you're like, okay, well then if you're not going to give it to me, I'm not taking the job. So, that's a difference in power dynamic. Really recognizing when that power dynamic has swung, I think it makes a difference. But I was never good at asking for a raise. And actually, I always cared more about not having to come in before 9. So that was usually what I negotiated for. Not kidding. Had a boss who told me stop coming in at 8.
Sarah, I'm interested in hearing about your insights on that angel problem here. Specifically, one of the things that I've been seeing, I am an investor at the Seattle Angels Conference. You know, I didn't even have a lot of money, but I really realized both our money, my husband and I, we had, you know, corporate jobs, and we immediately, when I realized, I can do this, I felt as if we got to take this chance, kind of, right? But one of the things that I realized is I saw women specifically. I actually got about 10 angels I forced them to invest. No, I mean, you know,
I know what you mean.
in a biz dev way. But I found out it's very, very startling. People with a lot of good money, and they've got good $1 million to $2 million worth house, they have absolutely zero feeling of wanting to do it or even excited about looking at it. But rather also, I've been called to the side by some of our colleagues and said, don't do this because, you know, if this goes bad, you'll be the bad one. You should know that. So, and then another one is that the woman, this is MBA from Wharton and all of that, okay, but they've had corporate jobs. MBA. She said, I dragged her to the conference and she said, I had to drop. And I asked why. I couldn't get my husband to say yes to put $10,000. You worked all your life. She wants to do it, but she wasn't able to. So I'm really puzzled as to how can we, okay, so my first investment is 4x now.
Right. So congratulations, because that's not how it usually works out. Yes. So, you know, look, there's a whole bunch of talk about this, specifically in this town, because as we said, there's so many nonprofits. So this whole idea of like, oh my God, you could put money in and it goes to nothing. What do you think happens when you give it to a nonprofit? Exactly. So the same people who are writing 6-figure checks to nonprofits and getting their name in a book could be, in fact, creating whole new industries, creating thousands of jobs, transforming the way that we live our lives. But the risk profile of failure becomes this overwhelming burden. So the thing that I like about what Seattle Angel Conference, Seattle Angel Fund specifically attempt to do is they do attempt to get people at a relatively low price point into a portfolio. I frankly think you're better off doing it on AngelList or the equivalent where you can write small checks and pick your companies. Because I have a little bit of argument about some of the other things that go with those two organizations. But it's about portfolio, right? Any asset class, it's portfolio. Like you can't put all your money into one. It's really rare that you have success. But the getting past this idea of it goes to zero is something you either can get there or you can't. And I don't think you can teach it, right? It's a risk profile thing. It's why it's really interesting. Actually, in fact, in this country, women actually control more wealth than men, right? And a lot of that is because they outlive men and they will inherit wealth as well as make their own and control their own. The number one place that money goes is to a dead husband's alma mater, right? Zero value. Like, really? What's that doing? And so part of it is like the awareness of what you could do with that. That's a big piece. But the other part is like the risk profile and what you get back from it of participating in this asset class. But this asset class creates massive amounts of wealth. I mean, I think that's the other thing that's interesting about the blockchain crypto currency is like we've just barely scraped what kind of wealth that's going to create. And so all of us are trying to figure out how to play in that because you're going to have that asset class too.
2 more questions, guys.
I'm curious on your insights about this. I already own a business. It's a retail outlet for 13 years. I don't want to do it anymore. I'm kind of looking to get out of it this year and maybe plug into a startup that's really gritty. I've never worked for a large corporation. I've always worked for a small entrepreneur. They've always left me alone to fix it, make it better, and I've made it up as I go. And always been successful at it. How could I find some place to plug in
Depends on how much you want to get paid.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Um,
What's get paid mean?
I mean, the thing that's interesting about that kind of parallel experience, especially in a small retail, is like, man, you got to wear every hat and be nice to people, right? Like that's I'm not even trying to be funny. Like that's hard, and there are a lot of startups that are missing those sort of human skills. I would probably go in as the person who does everything. The office manager, HR person, basic bookkeeper, like the person who does everything. Because they'll pay for that, and you get to wear a ton of hats, and you need to be a nice person. Or fake it.
Last question, guys. All the way back there.
What hits your sweet spot? So I was just at the Startup Grind Global Conference, and anytime anybody was identified as an investor, it was like there was blood in the water. Everybody was around them. So, and I heard one investor talk about, like, I'm not for everybody. Like, if I already have a makeup company in my portfolio, like, I'm done. Like,
Yes.
don't talk to me anymore.
Yeah.
Like, go look for somebody else, right? So like you as an investor, what are you looking for?
I have a makeup company in my portfolio, so I don't want to do that.
Set meetings from. Who are you taking?
Yeah, so it's interesting because so I look at most of my deals in Seattle with another angel named Serena Glover. She and I approach things very similarly, not completely, but very similarly. We have a kind of pretty close parallel background, and we're both two of the only people who actually do consumer in Seattle. And we used to take a meeting with most people who would ask, right? Especially because we would at least want to do is give them feedback on their pitch. And what we realized was we were taking way too many meetings and we couldn't do it. So what we try and do now for people, for most people, is try and do it at scale. So we'll do these kind of events. We'll do pitch clinics with other people who are hosting them in town. We'll sit on a lot of panels. And then sort of beyond that, we each have little areas that we're interested in. Serena loves certain things about agriculture. She grew up on a farm. So she looks at the problems in our food chain and gets very interested in that. For me, like disruptive consumer technologies are still the most interesting thing. They're the thing I get the least of that I would love to have more. That's not e-commerce, by the way. Like e-commerce is like, I'm not really an e-commerce person. I've done some, but I don't add as much value there. Like deep consumer technologies changing the way that human beings actually interact with technology, that's interesting to me, not hardware. I've also like done a couple hardware deals, like, I don't ever want to do hardware again. Right? Hardware's hard.
Hardware's hard. Super hard.
I'll take that last question.
I was curious to know if anything has changed from last 10 years in the startup ecosystem and today. Like, how do you compare the two times?
There's so many things, but one of the trends that happened that I've sort of tracked from the beginning when I was at startups to now being on the other side is what I'll call sort of the super incubators / accelerators, the Y Combinators, the 500 startups, the Techstars. Did some really interesting things to the ecosystem, some of them very good, some of them very bad. The good things is that it gave entrepreneurs a very accelerated jump start into their fundraising process and really tuned them up to talk to investors. The bad thing it did in Silicon Valley was it created this fear of missing out with very young VCs that drove up seed rounds to astronomical prices, which then took mature VCs who normally would have written an A to say, too expensive, we're not really gonna do that, we'll wait for the B when it corrects. And it changed all of the metrics and the amounts for when people raise. And at first, it was just like, oh my God, there's like, of course you raise it at a 10 million pre. Like, no. Like, none of this is worth 10 million, except the fact that you've got competitive term sheets. So of course you can get 10 million pre. But what that meant was there was like so many A's with like these crazy valuations that people just waited to write the B. They're like, sort it out. So then the B's got really restrictive because all of the money was tied up in these crazy valuations of the B's, or of the A's. So then the B's got selective and that tightened it up, and then the C's got kind of like a little bit tight, they moved up, right? Like, so the total amount and how long you had to wait and what you had to accomplish to get that sort of changed. Now the pendulum has swung the other direction, and what you're seeing now is it's really hard to get anybody to write an early check. What they want now, like, I mean, even 2 years ago, 100 ARR for a SaaS business was a serious A. Now, you better have 150 and defensible moat. That's an A, right? That's a shift in 2 years. And the difference between 100 MRR and 150 MRR, sorry, I meant MRR, not ARR. 100 MRR and 150 MRR is massive, right? Like, it's 4 salespeople. It's like, you know, an extra 40 customers. That's a year down the road. Right, so those are the things that have changed the most. Whereas if you went pre-500 startups, pre-Y Combinator, pre-Techstars, there weren't as many, but people were going in a very different approach. It wasn't so systemic, right? It was a lot more one-offs.
You're awesome.
Thank you. Sorry.
Um,